The Bible reading today is coming from the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 to 13. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be the king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his height or appearance, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah.
Morning. If we haven't met, I know there's lots of visitors here this morning for that encouraging baptism. My name's Josh. I'm on the pastoral team here, do lots of work with the youth, among other things, and love a chance to open the Bible and talk about how God shows himself to us, shows ourselves to us in his word, and transforms our lives as a result. So very glad to be opening this part of the Bible with you guys this morning. Now, we've been working our way through the book of 1 Samuel, if you're just here for this morning or if you've joined us in the last few weeks. And as we've been working our way through the book of 1 Samuel, what's happened so far is a bunch of humans have initiated a process of wanting a new king. Right? We've seen how leadership plays out when humans are the architects of it. Right? Because the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, back in chapter 8, came to God and said, "We want to have a king like the other nations." And the story there played out where people wanted a king, and so people got the king that people wanted, right? And it was all driven by the people. And so it's actually been a couple of weeks of hearing some pretty tough lessons, right, of what went on with that king named Saul. Well, now, in the passage that we're about to look at this morning, it's time for a new king, right? A new king to be anointed, as we just heard read out. And as we have a look at verse 1, where our reading started, we'll notice a difference to that first king where the people wanted a king, and so the people chose a king that was the sort of king that the people wanted. Who is it who initiates this time? A turning in our story that's super important. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn? I've rejected him. Fill your horn with oil, be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." Up until this point, we've been hearing what happens when people kind of drive the car, steer the ship when it comes to choosing leadership. And we've heard some painful lessons. Now, we get the encouraging lessons. The beautiful truths of what happens when God says, not your way anymore, I'm going to show you my way. And so we've got some great encouragements and challenges from his word as we look at who God chooses to be the king of his people. How about I just pray for us, that as God shows us this window into his character and us, that we will be encouraged. Let me pray. Lord God, we do thank you that you show yourself to us, and you show humanity to us, and Lord, that as you do those things in your word, that is a blessing to us for our good and for our joy. Please help us to receive your word this morning in a way that helps us to know you better, and that by the end helps us to know and love Jesus more. And we ask it in his name. Amen. All right, so here's the story. We'll track a little bit through the narrative, though there's some key bits where I think God has a lot to say to us this morning. As we just read in verse 1, Samuel is told to go and anoint a new king. And so his first response is actually he's scared, right? His first response is, if Saul hears about that, he'll kill me. Now, that's a pretty astute response, because generally if one guy's king, it's not a great idea as a public figure to go and say a different person is king. There's kind of a word for that, right? It's treason. And most kings throughout history have had a pretty consistent punishment for treason, which is execution, right? And so on the one hand, very reasonable that Samuel's like, if Saul finds out, he's going to kill me. But also showing us the depth of the arc that Saul has been on, which if you've been here regularly, you've been following. That now God's own prophet doesn't feel safe because he knows that Saul has degenerated to a point that he would knowingly kill God's representative if it meant keeping his own power, right? There's where Saul's arc is up to now, that Samuel himself doesn't feel safe. And so God says, that's okay, take a heifer along with you, do a sacrifice when you get to Bethlehem. That'll be a good kind of cover story if Saul finds out and he's wanting to know what's going on. Seems like a clever dodge, though. Does the God of the universe need to do clever dodges? Maybe not, right? And so maybe there's another reason for it. If you've been here with us, or let me fill you in if you haven't, this actually sets up a situation that's important, because it sets up a situation where Samuel is in a town sacrificing an animal and having a feast where they're going to anoint a king, which actually happened 6 chapters ago. Right? Back in chapter 9 and 10, Samuel was sacrificing an animal and having a feast, and Saul turned up because he was out looking for donkeys, remember? Saul turned up at the feast, and a king was anointed. Right? God sets this situation up to very much show us that what happened with Saul that has gone one way, God's going to do again with the new king. Right? It's meant to look like this same thing is happening again, but this time God is the one who is choosing the king. Samuel gets there and he's ready to do the sacrifice. He invites the elders of the town. He invites Jesse and his sons to come and attend it. And we find out, pretty sadly, but I think it's a bit of a challenge for us as well and a reminder, that after everything that's happened with Saul, Samuel still hasn't really learned his lesson. And Jesse still hasn't learned a lesson. And so it's worth noticing as we go through and make sure we learn this lesson, right? When he gets there, it's time to choose a king. There we go. And when they arrive, Samuel sees Eliab. He's the oldest of the sons. He sees Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. Now, we might not know why it is he's picking Eliab, but God makes it pretty clear in his response. Don't consider his appearance or his height, right? We've been following all of these chapters of a guy, Saul, who was chosen to be king based mainly on his height, right? a full head taller than everyone else. He looked like a king, and he was chosen because he looked grand like a king, and it's been disaster after disaster. And so after all of those disasters, Saul rejecting God, God rejecting Saul, Samuel now ends up in a place where God said, I'm going to choose a king. And he gets there, and he sees someone who looks like Saul, and so what does he say? That must be the next king. Right? The tall guy must be the next king. God's famous response, we're going to think about this morning. What is God's famous response? Don't consider how tall he is, how pretty he looks. I've rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The Lord doesn't look at what people look at. People look at outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. What a wonderfully terrifying truth for God to tell humanity. Isn't it? Wonderful for a lot of reasons. People look at outward appearance. Has that ever been more true or more damagingly true than 2025? In 2024. It just is ramping up, right? I got a feeling it'll be worse in 2026. I don't know. I didn't live in ancient times. Maybe they had their own battles. But my goodness, the focus on what we look like and how we present to one another in this modern world. Research out over the last couple of years into pretty people, attractive people, has shown pretty consistently that not only do people who are attractive to other humans tend to have better social environments and social opportunities. I guess that makes sense. They're the popular ones, right? But that trickles into things like better hiring prospects, more likely to be promoted, statistically higher salaries, right? Higher perceptions of competence of pretty people, right? And not just competence even without qualifications or training, but perceptions of trustworthiness. Who would you believe? Who would you trust? The pretty people. Right? The way we work as humans, we like attractive people, we like being around attractive people, and we listen to attractive people. And so, doesn't that mean we all also want to be attractive people? We wish we were the attractive people. Maybe we're glad we are the attractive people. So that more than at any other point in human history, we are just hyper-focused on how we look to other people. And we dedicate so much time and money and emotional energy to cultivating how we're perceived by others. From the superficial makeup and hair and clothes and shoes, trying to modify our body with dieting and workouts and all kinds of other things. Or maybe we go for the, is it easier? Maybe it's not, route of using filters and making sure we catch just the right lighting for our photos, getting those kind of odd angles, but we think that's the flattering angle to be taking the shot from before we put it out for the rest of the world to see, making sure everything's framed just right and we carefully curate, right? Make sure we've got live mode on when we take that photo so we can choose which of the 120 different frames makes us look best before we share it with the world. Right? We're just hyper vigilant to how we look to others, aren't we? And it's not just us in particular, it trickles out to my car, and what does that say about me? My house, what suburb I've bought into, what do these things make people think of me? And not just who we are physically and how we dress, what's attached to us, cars and homes, but our behavior as well. I just focused on what do other people see when they look at me. We put on our Sunday smiles, especially on Sundays, but probably on most other days as well, right? The face that we want to show to the rest of the world. I want to make sure when everyone sees me out in public, I come across as patient and kind, no matter who I really am on the inside in those moments. Right? I want to make sure that when someone sees me, they see someone who's happy, no matter what's really going on the inside. I want to appear busy to the world, even though I'm actually profoundly lazy. Or maybe, for a lot of us, I want to look to the world like I'm relaxed and have everything under control, when actually on the inside I'm drowning. People look at outward appearance, and it is crushing. It's a burden. And what does God say? I don't look at the outward appearance, I look at the heart. That stuff is meaningless to him. That's not what he sees. How refreshing is it to know that God doesn't value all that stuff. He doesn't care if your car is a mess or your hair's a mess or your nose got hit by cricket balls 3 too many times, right? overweight or underweight, right? He doesn't care. All of the things that we do to try to maintain other people's opinions of us, we don't need to do that for him. He is willing to look straight past the insecurities that we're afraid no other people look past, right? And see the real us. See our hearts. What a beautiful thing that he sees who we really are underneath all of those insecurities. And yet, what's the flip side? It's wonderful, but it's also a little bit terrifying, right? Isn't it a weighty thing? Because we spend so much time making sure we look okay on the outside in all those different ways. And yet God says, I see straight through it all. Right? I see straight through to what's on the inside. None of those things trick him. We can't fake it to him. We can't distract from our inside ugly with some outside decorations with God. He sees straight through. What a beautiful comfort, and also yet how terrifying. I wonder this morning if you pause and just consider when God looks at you and he's not fooled by anything that everyone else is fooled by, but he's not distracted by anything that everyone else is distracted by. When he looks straight through to your heart, what does he see? When he sees the true you, what does he see? I hope that by his grace he sees some really beautiful things that maybe no one else around you notices or appreciates. And if there's some things that it's worrying to hear that, then there's just some wonderful stuff we can quickly pick up from David, right? Because we hear good things about David's heart. Some of those were said before he was born, right? In chapter 13, a man after God's own heart. He's maybe a baby at that point, maybe not even, right? This isn't David making sure he's got a polished enough heart. This is a work that God's doing in him right from the start. And at the end of chapter 16, the very end of our reading, we were told he was filled with the Holy Spirit. How is it that David's heart was able to stand before God and be one who God saw past his appearance to his heart? It's because of what God was doing. Psalm 51, when David makes an absolute mess of some stuff, reveals some of the ugliness in his own heart, and he's confronted with it. What does he cry out to God? Create in me a clean heart. How is it David's heart is dealt with? By running to God. He's filled with the Spirit, and he cries out to God. Those same promises follow through to those of us who live well after David. In Ezekiel later on in the Old Testament, God makes a promise, I will give you a new heart. I will put my Spirit in you. I'll change your heart of stone, give you a heart of flesh, put my Spirit in you so that you will follow my laws and decrees. This is a work that God does in his people as they walk in step with his Spirit. We find in the New Testament what happens after Jesus returns to heaven. His Spirit is poured out on all of us who trust in him. So that if you feel any kind of shame at the fact that God sees straight through to your heart and you want to do something about that, what we need to do is not feel guilty and ashamed. What we need to do is, like David, cry out to God. Say, God, please wash my heart clean. Make me new by your Spirit. And he promises that he will. The solution is a heart washed clean and walking with him. But for now, let's get back to our story. Where were we up to? Samuel's there. Eliab's come out. Oh, he's tall, that's him. Nope, God doesn't look at the outside. God looks at the heart. Brother after brother after brother are brought out, and consistently, that's not him, that's not him, that's not him. Until, as we get through verse 11, there is still the youngest, Jesse answered. He's tending the sheep. Samuel says, send him in. We're not going to sit down and have dinner until he gets here. So he sent for him and had him brought in. Now, what do we expect at this point? Saul was impressive and looked like a king. So surely now, since God doesn't care about the outside, we're going to get someone who doesn't look anything like a king, right? Someone thoroughly unimpressive. Generally, someone like this, right? This is little David, isn't it? With little ringlets, cute little kid. Maybe, kind of, but probably not quite, right? What do we actually get as we read the verses? Verse 12, he was glowing with health and had fine appearance and handsome features. And we just get told that stuff doesn't matter, right? But he's good looking. He's got fine features, a handsome guy. Later in the chapter, we're going to find out that This is some word that gets back to Saul. He is a brave man and a warrior, starting not to seem just like that little kid, right? Someone who has a reputation already for valor and being a warrior. Maybe not just that tiny little kid. He's called young because he doesn't go off to battle, but that suggests he's probably below 20. Still not even definite, but probably below 20. As we start to pull these things together, we start thinking he's probably very close to 20, if not just a little bit over, because here's some of the other stuff that goes on. When he's talking to Saul about whether or not he can fight Goliath, he says, "Your servant has been keeping the sheep. When a lion or bear came, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it." Now, no offense to Boaz, but my guess is this is not a teenage boy, right? This is not the David that we saw before. This is, I'm going to grab these creatures and punch them in the head till they die, right? This is not unimpressive. I don't know what it takes to impress you guys. Those animals aren't over in Israel anymore, not just because David punched them all, but in kind of medieval times they were hunted a lot, right? And so they're not there, but were there in the ancient world. And David says, I fought them with my bare hands. This is who David was. Sure, he's called young a bunch of times, including when he goes and fights Goliath. But when he's about to fight Goliath, there's this point where Saul dresses David in Saul's own gear, right? His own tunic and armor. We often imagine that's this little kid and it's laughable comedy, right? Why did we put all this big armor on a kid? But it doesn't say any problem with the stuff fitting. Do you notice that? David fastened on the sword over the tunic, tried walking around because he wasn't used to it. I can't go in these because I'm not used to them. Saul is the tallest guy in the kingdom. And David doesn't even say this stuff's too big. In fact, when Saul looked at David, he thought, my stuff probably fits that guy. Right? Does that kind of change our perspective of David a little bit? Right? Probably not tiny, little, weak, unimpressive kid. Someone who looks like Saul's gear would fit him, and when he tries it on, he never says it doesn't fit. Right? David is impressive. Maybe the reason he didn't want to put on any armor is because he's not Bart Simpson with a slingshot. Let's see if this one will click through. Maybe it won't. Got a little video to show you guys. Cliff, can you just click on that one for me and see if it'll play? If not, I'll demonstrate it up here in person. I won't really. Never mind, I'll have to show you afterwards. Trust me, if you look up on YouTube, have a look at the sort of slings that David used, right? Come and talk to me afterwards. I'll show you on my phone. It is an absurdly athletic weapon to be using, right? David's not sneaking around with a slingshot like a little punk kid. David is a impressive, honed warrior. Not a helpless little boy desperately needing a miracle to have any chance, but actually profoundly impressive. The difference is not Saul was impressive, but David isn't. What's the difference then? Because we make this mistake because we still get so caught up in what do people look like on the outside. Isn't that what God just corrected? Didn't God just say, I don't care what someone looks like from the outside? And we go, oh, well, if that's why Saul's no good and Eliab's no good, well, David's outside must be different to theirs. And we've missed the point. God doesn't say the outside needs to be unimpressive. God says, I don't care about the outside. It's the inside. It's the heart. What can we figure out about that then? Well, in the descriptions of the outside, what was David never called? He was handsome, he was a man of valor, he was a warrior. It's suggested from the story like he's tall, but he's never described as tall. Strange, right? That Saul's stuff fits him, but he's never described as tall. Why is that? It's actually for a pretty important reason. In the book of 1 Samuel, the word tall, this particular word for tall in Hebrew, which we kind of lose in the way we translate it, right? This particular word for tall comes up a bunch of times at very key points that we might miss. It comes up here in 16 to describe Eliab. It comes up back in 9 and 10 to describe Saul. But it actually comes up all the way back in Hannah's song, right at the start. Do you remember Hannah, the woman who went to the temple wanting to have a kid and has Samuel, and that's how the whole story starts? She sings a song, and she talks in that song. She actually uses the word twice in a row to really emphasize it in chapter 2, verse 3. Can we skip across, Cliff, maybe to the one that says chapter 2, verse 3, down the bottom? Oh, it's up there, it's just not there. You guys can still see, you can still hear me, we'll keep going. Here's the verse. It says, "Do not keep talking so proudly." Obvious, isn't it? How do we miss it? Here's the thing. It's kind of a turn of phrase being used by Hannah, which if we look at what she actually says, here's what she says. "Do not keep talking, tall one, tall one." Which doesn't really get across the point of what she's saying. So our guys, when they put it into English, they put in what she is intending by that phrase, which is being proud, being lofty, thinking of yourself as grand. But what's the way of actually saying it in Hebrew? Tall one. The same kind of tall one that comes up in chapter 9 and 10 and 16. Right? Tall one is actually being used kind of poetically to describe someone who is high and mighty, lofty, proud, arrogant. It comes up over and over again through the Bible. Isaiah chapter 2, the eyes of the arrogant. The phrase there is actually people with tall eyes or high eyes, lofty eyes. One that connects to our story in 1 Samuel a little bit. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit, a tall spirit before the fall. What happens to the tall guys in the book of 1 Samuel? What happens to who's described as tall? Goliath. What's he do? Fall. Who else is described as tall? Saul. What happens by the end of the book of Samuel? Come back in a few weeks and find out. Or read on, right? No spoilers. But tall guys fall, metaphorically. David himself, when he's writing a song, Psalm 131 says, "My heart is not tall." It doesn't matter that Saul's armor fit him. His heart wasn't tall. That's the difference between Saul and David. Saul was lofty. At his feast, remember there were the two feasts? At Saul's feast, he's got the place of honor. He's disobeying God because he knows better. And then he's begging God to still honor him in front of the elders. In chapter 15, he's setting up a monument to himself. Pride is his downfall consistently. What about David, who's not tall? His heart's not tall. Not even invited to the feast. Someone has to go and find him out looking after the sheep. Remember, he's impressive. He's been out faithfully looking after the sheep, training with that sling hour after hour, keeping himself in good enough shape that he can punch a lion in the head, right? Here's a weapon. But what does he have to say about that? "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me out of the hands of this Philistine." That's right before he fights Goliath. He has worked so hard to be so confident and so impressive. And then when he gets a chance to tell someone about how the fact that he killed a lion and he killed a bear, what does he say? God rescued me. And when he's worked hard enough to be able to sling that rock and kill Goliath, what does he say? I'm trusting God will give me that victory. What was David's heart? Humility and trust. He wasn't humble because he was unimpressive and just needed a miraculous victory to sneak out of a situation that he got himself into. He was impressive naturally, and he had worked hard to become even more so. Handsome, well-spoken, warrior, highly competent, and yet he recognized God and gave God the credit and trusted God for the next victory. What did Saul have going for him? He was really tall. Didn't even earn it. You just come out that way. Well, it just happens, right? Saul did nothing to earn that, and yet he was proud, and that was his downfall. Because God doesn't care how impressive we are, but that doesn't mean we have to be unimpressive either. God sees our heart. And so when he sees your heart, does he see someone who is humble? Who takes all of their victories, all of their triumphs, and says, that is God. Thank you. And sees the battles around the corner and says, I'm going to trust him for that. Do we have humble, obedient hearts? Where did David develop that humble faithfulness? A couple of things we can see from this, some beautiful things. Where did he learn them? Out in the fields as a shepherd. When God chose the king for his people, when it was his turn to show them who to choose as king, he didn't choose some noble son, some politician, someone who was trained in the military. He chooses a shepherd, someone who has been outcast, guiding and protecting and defending some vulnerable little creatures. For the last few weeks, we've been looking at Saul, and we've been thinking, what does or should leadership look like? If we know God, if we love him, what does it look like? And here's God's answer. What does leadership look like? It's to have the heart of a shepherd. And that matters because a whole bunch of us are leaders in all different areas in our lives, right? From our family and our social networks, perhaps in your workplace, perhaps in ministries here at church. We lead other people, and God's clear answer to who should I be is be a shepherd. That follows all the way through the Old Testament in Ezekiel chapter 34. The leaders of God's people. Woe to you, what are they called? Shepherds. Shouldn't the shepherds take care of the flock? You haven't strengthened the weak, healed the sick, bound up the injured. You've not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You've ruled them harshly and brutally. So I am against you. I will hold you accountable. Right, this picture, God says, what should a leader be? A shepherd who seeks after the lost, who looks after the sick and the injured, who protects and loves and cares for those entrusted to them. That's the heart of the shepherd. And so if you have somewhere in your life that others are under your care, and just be a leader to them, be a shepherd to them. But ultimately, it's not meant to all just be about us, right? It's not about us. That same thing from Ezekiel, if we read just the next bit. God doesn't say, so I'll send Josh, or I'll send... This is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep. God says, I'll turn up and shepherd my sheep. And so that brings us wonderfully and beautifully to who? To Jesus, right? Jesus, who had every right to be lofty. Jesus, who was more impressive even than David. But Jesus, who describes himself, John 10, as a good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. God's true and ultimate king, who everyone thought was going to be another come in and carve up the Romans and be a huge military leader, and came as a shepherd who would lay down his life. The true king of whom David was just a hint, not just a shadow. The one who, like I said, has every right to be lofty and exalted, right? Proud and arrogant. And yet, what did we say in the creed earlier? He made himself nothing. Took on the very nature of a servant. The one who sought us when we were lost and keeps seeking us every time we get lost. Who binds us up when we are injured. Who strengthens us when we are weak. Who heals us from the curse of sin and so gives us life that will last forever. Jesus. So this morning, remember, God doesn't care what's on the outside. You don't have to fake it for him, and you can't fake it for him. He cares about what's in your heart. As much as it is wonderful to think, I want my heart to look like David's, which is good, humble and trusting and obedient, it's better because we can look at the one that David was pointing to. Don't just think, how do I imitate David? How do I imitate Jesus? How, by the power of his Spirit working in me, do I have a heart full of humble obedience? Being shepherds to those who are under our care, and being grateful every day for the shepherd king that God has given us in Jesus. Let me pray. Jesus, we thank you that you are not a king like Saul, that though you are incredibly impressive, you are as a shepherd to us, loving us, providing for us, and defending us. Lord, help us not to worry what other people think of us, but to have eyes only for what you think of us. Help us to focus not on our outward appearance, but our hearts. Jesus, thank you that you have done everything to wash us clean, and so please give us humble hearts that trust in you all the days of our lives. We ask it in your